Aristotle was the last of the big three Greek philosophers of the classical era. Socrates passed the torch to Plato, and Plato to Aristotle. The latter is arguably the first Homo universalis, a polymath. Of course, the term was coined 17 centuries later, during Renaissance, so I guess Aristotle was in a way ahead of his time. In his 62 years, Aristotle thought and wrote about everything imaginable, from practical philosophy and issues like justice, ethics, politics, to natural philosophy, physics, astronomy, biology, to even metaphysics. He studied under his famous mentor Plato for 20 years before he created his own famous school, the Walkers, or Peripatites. And of course, he tutored the even more famous Alexander the Great. However, it is possible that Aristotle was one of the conspirators who poisoned and ultimately assassinated Alexander the Great. Let's begin the exploration of this theory by first identifying what we know about Alexander's death. How did Alexander die? The truth is that we don't know exactly how Alexander died or why. Now there are many theories as to what killed Alexander. Some say malaria, others claim typhoid, excessive alcohol consumption, etc. All we know is that following a night of excessive drinking, Alexander became gravely ill and he developed the following symptoms. He developed high fever, he experienced progressive and symmetrical paralysis, and he laid in bed with excruciating pain for 12 days. Finally, Alexander passed away. His dead body did not show any signs of decomposition for 6 days. This last part inspired Dr. Kathleen Hall, a senior lecturer at Dunelin School of Medicine at the University of Otago, New Zealand, to suggest the following theory. According to Dr. Kathleen Hall, Alexander died of a very serious autoimmune disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome. GBS is a condition in which the immune system attacks healthy cells in the nervous system. She argues that Alexander might have contracted the disorder from an infection of Campylobacter pylori, a common bacterium at the time. According to Dr. Hall, this would explain all Alexander's symptoms: the high fever, the abdominal pain, and the progressive paralysis. The most astonishing sub-conclusion from this research, however, is in relation to the 6 days of a non-decomposing Alexander's dead body. This research suggests that Alexander's body did not decompose because he was not dead yet. He was prematurely proclaimed dead because his breathing was so faint it could not be detected by his physicians. Hall states, his death may be the most famous case of pseudothanatos, or false diagnosis of death ever recorded. Now, if you found this theory intriguing, the next one is going to take you over the moon. Because among the many theories that attempt to explain Alexander's death, there are many that suggest that Alexander was actually assassinated by his rivals. And a particular one suggests that it was his famous teacher, Aristotle, who prepared the poison which ultimately killed Alexander. To begin this theory, we need to first meet our conspirators. By the year 324 BC, Alexander had done the impossible. He had completed the dream of his father, King Philip II, to take revenge against the Persians for their invasion to Greece in the years 492 BC and 480 BC. Within less than 10 years, Alexander managed to defeat the mightiest empire of his era and proclaim himself the undisputed king of Persia. He succeeded in a task that no Greek before him had ever dared to attempt. While Alexander was doing the impossible in Persia, he left this man, Antipater, in his place as the king regent of Greece. Antipater was a friend of his father and a trusted man to Alexander. He was successful in maintaining peace and stability back home while Alexander was campaigning. But at some point, the beloved mother of Alexander, Olympias, grew suspicious of Antipater. She accused him of placing his own people in key positions of power and she accused him of treason. Alexander demanded explanations. He ordered him to lead fresh troops into Asia and provide explanations for the accusations against him, while Craterus, one of Alexander's generals, was to return back home with the discharged Macedonian veterans and replace Antipater as the king regent. However, he did not comply to his orders. and instead of heading himself to Asia, he sent his son Cassander to meet with Alexander. According to the theory, the plan was never to offer Alexander explanations, but a cup of wine filled with poison. So Cassander traveled to Babylon, but he was quite hesitant to go through with the plan. They grew up together. They studied together under Aristotle. But upon his arrival, Cassander witnessed the Persian subjects on their knees performing the so-called proskinesis, an act of solemn expression of respect for the gods and people of importance. This was a ridiculous act, an unheard thing for a Greek. With a feeling of incomparable superiority against the local colonized people, Cassander laughed hysterically. His laughter echoed the throne room. Alexander, in a burst of anger, grabbed him by his hair and smashed his head on the wall. This simple act of anger might have changed history as we know it. This was the trigger that turned a friend into a foe. Cassander not only went through with the plan to assassinate Alexander, but eventually he was the one to eliminate the bloodline of Alexander the Great. But more on that on an upcoming episode. So with his consciousness now clean, Cassander gave the poison to his brother Iolaus, who was the bartender of Alexander, his cupbearer. He put it into Alexander's drink, and a few hours later, Alexander found himself in his deathbed. Now, how is Aristotle related to this conspiracy theory? Well, the Macedonians knew close to nothing about poisons. Aristotle, however, was an expert. Yet again, what was his motive? Why would Aristotle want to kill Alexander? Let's take a look at Aristotle's motives. Let's start with the weakest one and let's escalate progressively. In the year 349 BC, King Philip II conquered and destroyed the independent and prosperous city of Stagira, an ally to Athens and the birthplace of Aristotle. In the year 338 BC, Aristotle traveled back to his birthland under the invitation of King Philip II. The latter invited Aristotle to become the tutor of his young son and the successor to the throne of Macedonians. Aristotle agreed on the term that Philip would restore Stagira. Now Stagira was indeed restored, either during the time of King Philip or by Alexander himself. The city, however, never found itself in its former brilliance. Aristotle might have kept a grudge on this matter. Now the second reason why Aristotle might be getting hostile with Alexander could be Alexander's excess. Aristotle taught Alexander many things: math, geography, ethics, but most importantly, balance. To live life according to the golden mean between excess and efficiency. But Alexander was at the extremes even as a child. As an adult, he was the personification of excess. Everything Alexander did was at the extremes. When he fought, he was in the front line. He was literally the one to draw first blood. When he was festive, he went all out. In one occasion, he burned down the famous city of Persepolis on a dare by an Athenian prostitute called Thais. Following the conquest of the city, the former jewel of the Persian Empire would remain in history as the place of 40 columns. That's all that was left from Alexander's fury. A similar point can be made on the matter of Alexander's leadership towards his newly conquered subjects. Aristotle, despite his brilliance, he was somehow of a racist. All that is Greek is beautiful and worth dying for, and everything that is not is barbaric. However, Alexander ruled his new subjects in a way that would make Machiavelli proud. He adapted their customs, their traditions, and treated them in a way that they were accustomed to. He did not belittle their different culture, he saw beauty in it. For these reasons, it seems that master and student grew apart. After his arrival in Athens and the creation of his famous school, which by the way, Aristotle was able to create due to Alexander's intervention, he wrote 400 papers. To put this into perspective, in today's standards, that would be equal to 11,000 pages or 10 million words. Alexander isn't mentioned a single time. However, you would say, okay, that's plenty enough reason to dislike someone. But kill him? Well, that's a little bit too much, don't you think? Well, the most compelling argument is this theory coming up. The conspiracy of the nobleman's youth. Philip II, Alexander's father, had issued a law by which the nobleman's children would become followers and personal attendants to the Macedonian king. This way, the Macedonian youth would have an opportunity to be nurtured by the king himself so that they become great leaders in the future, and at the same time, the king would be sure that the Macedonian elite would not plot against him. These boys were both apprentices and hostages. As the story goes, Alexander and the gang went hunting. Alexander spotted a wild boar, but before he was able to make his move, a youngster named Hermolaus was quicker and killed the beast first. Alexander got furious. He removed him off his horse and ordered his men to whip him in front of his peers. Following this incident, Hermolaus swore to take revenge on Alexander. He convinced some of his peers to collaborate with him, and the boys agreed to assassinate Alexander during his sleep. The plan was ready. Everything was set. When Alexander would come back of his usual drinking, they would make their move. But as Alexander was heading back to his bed, the story tells us that he met with a Syrian witch, or priestess of sorts, who told him, "Alexander, don't go back to bed. Go back to drinking." By morning, the conspiracy was revealed. The boys were to stand trial. They were all sentenced to death. During the interrogation, though, and here historical sources get a little bit bizarre, everybody tells us a different story. Even the eyewitnesses like Aristobulus and Ptolemy. Nobody agrees on the same story. In any case, we know of this man, Alexander's personal historian and a philosopher called Callisthenes, who found himself accused of orchestrating the conspiracy. Callisthenes was ultimately accused of conspiracy against the king and he was executed. Now this man was Aristotle's nephew. He was the son of Aristotle's stepdad, and this is a pretty solid reason to make the famous philosopher prepare Alexander's final drink. As the story goes, Aristotle went to Styx waterfalls and there he found the bacteria needed to prepare his poison. A befitting poison for Alexander, as according to mythology, the water of Styx could paralyze even the gods of Olympus. This theory was dismissed for decades, because no one could identify a bacterium in Styx that could potentially cause Alexander's symptoms. But in 2011, Andriana Meyers of Stanford University and Antoinette Hayes of Pfizer Pharmaceuticals published a paper called The Deadly Styx River and the Death of Alexander. In this paper, they argue that the water of the river Styx contained callicemycin, a dangerous compound produced by bacteria that could explain all of Alexander's symptoms: high fever, progressive and symmetrical paralysis, excruciating abdominal pain. Now, could this insane theory be true? Let's summarize and let's make some honorable mentions that might support or refute this theory. This whole theory was popularized 6 years after Alexander's death by his mother Olympias. Following Alexander's death, the Battle of Diadochi began, the battle of Alexander's successors. Olympias was at war with Cassander. You remember this man, the guy who transferred the poison. At that point, Cassander was a contender. He was trying to become the king of the Macedons. Olympias killed one of Cassander's brothers and she defiled the grave of another one, Iolaus, the grave of the bartender, while spreading the theory we just discussed. Now nobody knows how exactly Iolaus died. Last time we hear about him is when he accompanied his sister Nicaea to Asia in order to marry Perdiccas, one of Alexander's generals and one of the contenders in the Battle of the Successors. Hyperides, an Athenian logographer and leader of the Athenian resistance against King Philip II and Alexander, proposed that this marriage was a reward to Iolaus for being the murderer of Alexander. By coincidence or not, Antipater executed Hyperides 1 year after Alexander's death. In the same year, Aristotle died as well. He entrusted his final will to none other than Antipater. Is that a coincidence? Well, probably, but I really wanted to mention it. Finally, in the year 309, Cassander, now king of Macedonians, he commanded Glaucias to secretly assassinate the 14-year-old son of Alexander, Alexander IV, and his wife Roxanne. The method of assassination? Poisoning. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing, join our community, become an honest explorer. Up until next week, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll be here with a brand new episode to help you all discover your inner explorers.